Chris, thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a fun little time of me taking you informally, but step by step through the process of preparing a reserve study. You're going to literally look over my shoulder as I'm going through some of the steps and going through the decision points. And as Chris mentioned, I know you're coming in here with some questions, and we want to be respectful of your interests and the particular things that might you came in here hoping to learn. So if at any point in time through this session you do have a question, or if you came in with a question in mind, you see a dialog box at the right-hand portion of your screen that Chris mentioned. Feel free to type in a question right into that box. And then later on, there will be an opportunity for you to actually raise your hand. And if you have a microphone hookup or a headset on your computer, you'll be able to literally, just like I am now, ask your question in front of the group, and I'll answer the group right online. So let's test out everyone's ability to be with us here. Chris had a little bit of audience involvement at the beginning, but you'll also see a hands raised. So at this point in time, just want to make sure you're with me and following along. So give me a hands raised to show that you're with me and ready for the presentation to start. Give me a hands raised. A couple more seconds, everybody. Look for that hands raised icon. Very good. Okay, I'm going to put your hands down. Now remember, at any point in time from this point forward, if you have a question, please type it in, and then later on at the end we'll perhaps have someone ask a question live. Now let me introduce you to this sample property that I'm going to be talking about today. It's 56 units. So kind of medium size. It's a townhome property built in 1972, so it's 40 years old at this point in time. And what does that mean? Well, it won't show as much deterioration as in some other areas of the country. This is a Southern California property. One pool, shingle roof on the residential buildings, and flat carport roofs. You can see that, as is typical, when we're preparing to do a reserve study, we'll get a map of the association, we'll get the governing documents, at least the first time, and we'll get a map of the association and kind of identify what's going on there at the association. Our style here at Association Reserves is to color code things and kind of document them for future reference. Our expectation is that we'll be involved not only in the preparation of one reserve study, but hopefully many through the years. So we keep a file on our clients. You can see the carport roofs here in kind of the maroon color. And the pool, of course, I always make my pools a blue color. Residential buildings are a light blue. I believe there's 16 residential buildings in this association. Clubhouse is this orangish color, right next to the pool in the center of the association. And the asphalt driveways off of the entry roadway system. So this is public road here, cul-de-sacs, and then the actual driveways into the carport areas are private asphalt. Actually, that's an issue at this association, one of those mysteries. This is the engagement that I'm going to talk through today was a with site visit reserve study update. And I think this is our fourth time working with this property. Two of those times, the association was under the impression that they were responsible for all the asphalt from this point forward into the association. And it was only recently that they got official clarity that it's not their asphalt. This roadway here is city roads. They had been doing some maintenance to it, and they found out that no, that's really the city's problem. They're only supposed to be responsible for maintenance here in the driveways. And so sometimes there will be some changes at an association just as the association gets smarter through the years. They're rectifying some old mistakes. Sometimes we see that or hear about that, I should say, in the operating budget when they find out that one of their meters is paying for water at the adjacent property, or one of the owners is paying for the electricity in the clubhouse, things like that. So there are some of these mysteries at community associations that need to get resolved through the years, and hopefully, and this is a basic premise of how we prepare reserve studies, we expect that the reserve study is going to get better and better and better. Each year we do the update, and each time we have an opportunity to fine-tune it to the style or needs or present demographics there at the association. Let me show you a few pictures so you can visualize and come along with me as I walk you through the property. This is what I was talking about. Property of driveways with flat or technically low slope carport roofs, stucco portions of the exterior, significant wood fencing at this association, some wood siding, and then hopefully you can see it. We've got, if you can see my mouse, you can see I'm pointing to the shingle roof over the front door area. And we've got a couple more pictures, another view of what's happening there. Some of the landscaping, common area landscaping, is within the private patios, so that's an issue at this association. For argument's sake, who trims this tree? Well, officially for this association it's common area, even though it's in this this unit's little backyard patio. So there are some the normal amount of uniquenesses and things that need to be asterisked for each particular community association. Let me show you the asphalt. As I said, this is a 40-year-old association. They have just light traffic in the driveway areas. You see garbage cans here along the sides of the homes. Every week the unit owners roll these out to the main roadway, so there's never any heavy trucks going in driving on association asphalt. So it has lasted this long, meaning 40 years, but as you can see, it's 40-year-old asphalt. They've got a legacy of cracks that have been repaired. It almost looks like an older person and the normal wrinkles that an older person will have on their face. This is the normal crack repairs that are evident with an older slab, older installation of asphalt. A couple more nuances to help you feel comfortable with the property. This is a close-up look of the siding. Wood siding at this place, they've done a pretty good job of painting on a regular basis, but it is showing 40 years of age and weathering, especially down low near the where the sprinklers hit it on almost a daily basis. You can see the roughness. If you could touch it with your hand, you'd feel that it's rough. You wouldn't want to rub your fingernails on it because you'd know that you're going to get some splinters under your fingernails. But it's starting to show moderate to significant deterioration depending on the orientation and depending on the specific location. And finally, let me show you a picture. I should say finally, I've got a lot of pictures here. This is a picture of the backyard patio fencing. Again, 40 years old. They've done a wonderful job of making it last this long. But as you can see in this picture, it is showing age and wear. You see some cracking in this corner 4x4. You can see some separation beginning to happen, some warping. And interestingly, again, this is common area fence, but you see a padlock here. This is not a padlock to go through into this family's backyard. This is in the corner of this fence is a little 3x3 foot little storage area, outdoor storage area. So the issue is you have at this association, by the governing documents, you have a common area fence, but you have a private little storage area where two of the walls, inside wall here and inside wall here, two of the four walls are private areas. So we have an interesting and perhaps unique, well, I shouldn't say unique because these types of uniquenesses happen everywhere, but but they have a combination of private space and a common area fence that makes up this structure. So that's one of the interesting things at this association. Also, a view from the roof looking down on those backyard patio fences. You can see that there is a unit on one side, a unit on another side, and so in addition to the perimeter portion of the fence, there's the divider portion between, let's say, unit number 1 and unit number 2. This was, I did the site inspection in January, shortly after Christmas holiday break, and so there's a bunch of lights up. Their barbecue has a winter cover on it, but the question at this association and every association is not just ownership, but who's responsible for maintenance of these assets. Well, at this association, even though this divider fence is officially owned by unit number 1 and unit number 2 in a shared asset, the association has maintenance responsibility for not only the perimeter areas of the fence, but the dividing areas of the fence. So that's a great example of making sure that you're identifying who's responsible for maintenance and not stopping at the question, who owns the asset. And then let me, as long as I'm up on the roof, let me show you a couple more pictures. I've got a good close-up of the shingle roof here. You can see as soon as it transfers out to your view. It's a good shingle roof installed not too many years ago. Obviously, a shingle roof or a roof at most associations is something the board cares very much about because everyone's sensitive to having a dry bedroom and living room and kitchen to live in. So the roof is in good shape. A little bit of tree debris getting accumulated, but generally the residential roofing areas are in pretty good shape throughout this association. And then I've got a view looking across to the carports from the roof. You can see that also the carport roof that roof surface is in pretty good condition. It's a few years into its life cycle. You can see the seams, but when you go walking around actually on that roof, everything's intact, nothing loose, no bubbling, no real problems with that surface. It's a good uniform regular surface. I'll talk a little bit more about the carports and some of the interesting things that have gone on there. Next picture that we'll come across is a picture of their little rec room. At some point in time, I can imagine this was a hustling, bustling, well-used little room, but at this point in time, it's very rarely used. They renovated it just to make sure that it's clean, so it's got a great shiny tile floor, it's well painted. When you look closely, it has some dated aspects, specifically the lights hanging from the ceiling and the bathrooms and the little kitchenette, but it is physically intact. It just is used at this point in time very rarely. So the question that we get to is, how do we get going on this reserve study? What are we going to actually do? Well, before I show you some of the actual decisions I'm making on this property, I want to give you a tour of our thinking process. I think if I outline the way my brain is working, it'll help you understand how I literally attack a reserve study project. And as I mentioned, this is a update with site visit engagement. Last time they hired us was a few years ago, so I guess, no, I'll get to that in just a moment. First things first, reserve study is made up of 3 parts, and it all builds on the component list. Here with this association, we've done a full reserve study many years ago, and it's at that point in time that we measured all that fencing, we measured the asphalt, and then as I said, we also measured some asphalt that really didn't apply, but we measured the buildings. We built the foundation of the reserve study, and the foundation of the reserve study is that component list. Built on that foundation, we then can calculate the reserve fund strength. It's the comparison of the cash that the association has to the needs of the association at this point in time, and that's something that's measured and in a a term, or measured and reported in a term called percent funded. And the last thing that is done with a reserve study is the actual funding. Once you know the components the association is responsible to maintain, and the strength, basically the starting point of the reserve fund, cash-wise, then you know how much you need to be funding. So it's in that order. Now what's interesting, and another way I can portray this, is that the component list is something that's based totally on observations, whereas the reserve fund strength and the funding plan are things that are calculated. So again, that's another way to understand that the component list is foundational to everything we do with the reserve study. So it's appropriate to make sure that we get that right. And another way to look at a reserve study is, in addition to the three parts, the component list, calculation of reserve fund strength, calculation of a funding plan, two of those parts are disclosures and one part is a recommendation. Obviously the component list is a disclosure. It discloses the current status of the physical assets of the association, and the percent funded, the report of reserve fund strength, is a disclosure of how well past boards have done in providing enough cash for the needs of the association. The funding plan is the recommendation, and that's our recommendation for action. Now we're guided in all this by National Reserve Study standards. It's not something that we just do here at Association Reserves. Fortunately, these are national standards, been in place since 1998, that guide our firm and all other reserve study firms in knowing exactly what percent funded means, in knowing exactly what an update with site visit reserve study means, all those important terms, and then of course it gives a set of standards so that people like me who do this all the time can earn a credential and report or advertise ourselves to prospects as being an expert in our field. Now, one of the key things the National Reserve Study Standards do for all of us, not just the professional, is to give us a four-part test that guides us to knowing what components are appropriate for inclusion in the reserve study. And that four-part test is shown here on screen. To be funded through reserves, an asset or a project needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility, it needs to be life limited, it needs to have a predictable remaining useful life, meaning you need to know where it is in the life cycle between new and failure, and that project needs to be above a minimum threshold cost. Basically, you don't want to be reserving for components or projects that you should more appropriately just handle out of the ongoing operational maintenance budget. For instance, I spoke about the sprinklers that are sprinkling not only the landscaping but the wood siding. If you have a broken sprinkler head, you wouldn't want to make a board resolution to withdraw funds from reserves to pay for a $5 sprinkler head. That's something you do out of ongoing maintenance. So you need to be clear on your dividing point between what ongoing maintenance is and reserves. So that gives us a good idea of the component list. And now let's go to looking at the component list that I established for this association. I'm going to exit out of the presentation and show you the component list. And here we have the component list for this association. I'm going to click a couple of things. There we go. I wanted to get my control panel back so I can make sure that you're seeing the same thing I am. Okay, notice a few things here. It's a list, and I'm going to scroll down. 38 components. What we find is that most associations, most normal residential community associations across the country can define their reserve component list in anywhere from 25 to 45 components. It's not an incredible, overwhelming number of components. And let me point out a few things. even though this is, I believe, the fourth time that we've prepared the reserve study for this association, we did make some changes. Now, specifically, railroad ties. This is the first time that the railroad ties appear on this reserve study. In the past, we had been led to believe that the landscape maintenance company was repairing the railroad ties. They are the short garden walls at minor local areas throughout the association. We've been led to believe that the landscape company was repairing them on an ongoing basis. Well, it turns out that was incorrect. Either that or they changed landscape companies, but at this point in time, the only way they see the railroad ties getting replaced is through reserve. So we added a line item for reserve funding of the railroad ties. And similarly, the patio furniture, we call it the patio furniture, it's the pool furniture. They had a few scattered pieces around the pool. In the past, they'd been replacing a chair or a table or a chaise lounge one at a time, but this component 404, I hope you can see on your screen, they realize that that's not a successful strategy and they need to embark on a more successful plan to just replace all at once every 8 years and get a nice clean matched set. Now, they did that here in 2012, right before my site inspection. This is a 2013 reserve study, and notice that the useful life is 8, but the remaining useful life is 7. That's because next year, the year that this is a reserve study for, that asset will be 1 year old. So when you're doing a reserve study, you need to remember and project where the person will be at the time that they're reading the reserve study. This is a reserve study for 2013. So those are a couple things to point out. Another thing that changed was the backflow devices. This landscape landscape company is maintaining the backflow devices on an ongoing basis. Line item 1001. So that disappeared from the reserve study. That went into the operating budget, specifically the landscape maintenance budget. And a few other things to note. We've identified more components here than we are funding. And let's look at 204 and 303, concrete swales and the air conditioning unit. Let me talk about the air conditioning unit. And to be more specific, let me take you out to our detail, and I'll walk you through. Sure. Here's the concrete swales. We've identified the concrete swales. We've measured them, but in this report, we're saying that the concrete surfaces typically have a long useful life with no expectation for complete replacement, repair as needed using operating funds. So we want to make sure that we're communicating clearly to the client what we see and what we're recommending so they don't think that we've just plain forgotten the concrete swales. In the air conditioner, you can see it's a wall unit hanging from the side of the clubhouse, and as I indicated, the clubhouse is rarely used. So this is a few $100 component that's rarely used, and our recommendation after talking with the client is expect to repair or replace as needed using operating funds. No need for reserve funding at this time. We kind of don't even care if it's working, so we're not going to fund for replacement. It's just an asset that the association isn't caring for at this point in time. So let me get back to our PowerPoint. Actually, no, let's get back to the component list. So that's why we will identify some things that we're not funding for through reserves. We want to make sure that this is a great communication document. As I indicated, one of the purposes of the reserve component list is as a disclosure document. We want to make sure that the association is understanding what's going on. Our style at Association Reserves is to show an estimate for the best costs and worst costs, kind of a range, so you can you as a board member will know that if, for instance, the concrete steps and sidewalk repairs, if they're somewhere in the $7,000 range, that's about the right number. We want to, again, be a good communication tool to you. Another thing to point out is what we call cycling. Cycling means that, for instance, the ironwork fence, component 503, follow along with me, we're showing that we're going to repair this every 10 years or so for a little under a couple $1,000. 10-year useful life, 0 years remaining useful life. If I scroll down and we look at our painting components, 1100, ironwork, wood fencing, light fixtures, you'll see that we are scheduling the ironwork to be painted at this point in time also with a 0 remaining useful life. That's what's called logical cycling. So we can have someone come out to the property, do the welding, do the repairs, and in the same year, hopefully just a week or so afterwards, the timing is there for that ironwork to get freshly painted. And as long as we're painting the ironwork, that's a great time to paint the wood fence, the light fixtures, do the other trim type of painting. And then you can see that we've cycled the stucco so that it will get painted every 15 years, which is every third time that all the other minor projects are painted. So we call that logical cycling. And another thing we try to do with the component list is show what's happening in the big picture. The wood siding, as I indicated earlier, is deteriorated, and they have plans at this point in time to replace the siding with a very long life material like a hardy plank, hardy board, and we anticipate that will be a 40-plus year life cycle. So at this point in time, we are indicating it will not have a useful life. It's a very extended life cycle with an expectation that in about 10 years we're going to replace that wood siding with something that will be almost effectively permanent. So that's an appropriate amount of time spent on the reserve component list, because that indeed, as I indicated, is the foundation for the reserve study. Now let me get back to the PowerPoint outline. After we've developed the component list and we're solid with it, the next thing we do is calculate the strength of the reserve fund, and that's a two-part process. We calculate the deterioration of the current assets, and that's called the fully funded balance. How much should there be set aside for each component? Very simply, it's a fractional age times the current estimated replacement cost. And then we take that fully funded balance, compare it to the actual reserve fund, multiply by 100 to get a number reported in terms of percentage, and that is the association's percent funded. And of course you're wondering, why do I care? Well, reserve fund strength is measured with percent funded. We do it because it reports much more accurately the strength of what's happening there at the association rather than just cash, because cash means different things to different associations. What we find across the country is that this is the profile of basically the population of associations as far as their percent funded rating. There's a few associations that are in the 0 to 30% funded range, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. The majority of associations are in this middle range, and then there's, again, associations out getting stronger and stronger and stronger, but not a whole lot of associations way out here to the right. But at least they have a strong reserve fund. Now, why do I say a strong reserve fund or a weak reserve fund? It's because of this special assessment risk. When the association doesn't have much cash on hand compared to the needs of the association, they have a higher risk of a reserve cash flow problem, and that manifests itself either as a special assessment or deferred maintenance. It's easier for us to measure special assessment, so that's what we're reporting here. When an association's percent funded is low, then they have a higher risk of special assessment. No surprise. And so this is how we report that. Basically, you can see that when the reserve fund is weak, there's a high risk of special assessment, and when the reserve fund is strong, there's a low risk of special assessment. Something important to know, and that's some great information that you get from your reserve study. And so that helps us understand part 2 of the reserve study, how we calculate the reserve fund strength. And let me show you how we actually do that with a property, with a client. We have a database of information that we use with gathering the reserve component information, but the number crunching is something we do with a number crunching tool. In our case, specifically Microsoft Excel. What we're going to do with this is you see the same component list that we saw in that listing earlier. We've plugged it into Microsoft Excel. And what we're going to do is calculate that fully funded balance. Let's see if I can find an easy one. Let's take the second line item, railroad ties. And let me make this just a little bit bigger. See, that makes it a little bit easier for you to read. Fully funded balance. For the second line item, railroad ties, 30-year useful life, 0 years remaining useful life, meaning it needs to be done now. Well, if the current cost is $12,000, then they need that money at this point in time. They need $12,000, and that's the deteriorated value of that asset. Let's see if I can find another one. Yeah, this one. Mailboxes, component 403, 15-year useful life with 5 years left, meaning 2/3 of the value, the economic value of the mailboxes have been used up. There's only 5 years left out of a total of 15. Well, if the current replacement cost is a little over $10,000 and 2/3 of the life is used up, then 2/3 of the replacement cost should be set aside in the reserve fund. And you can see that here with the fully funded balance of $6,833. So that's what's going on through the component list. We're calculating the fully funded balance. Then we compare that to the, I'm going to do that over here. This association starts with $232,000. Their calculated FFB, fully funded balance, is $900 and some thousand, and so their percent funded is 24.9%. And if you're paying attention a few minutes ago, that means that there's a pretty good chance of them having a special assessment. And indeed, these people, this association will need a special assessment. And let me show you how that kind of manifests itself. This association has some significant initial year expenses. Specifically, I can show you our software highlights all the components that have a remaining useful life of 0. So you can see that this association has a number of components that they need to address in this initial year. Most significantly, the wood fence. They're ready to finally do that project. That's a couple $100,000 at this point in time. When we add it all up, the expenses for this year are over $300,000. So they have a pretty big mountain to climb, and with only $232,000 to start with, they're going to need some extra cash in order to do their reserve funding without a special assessment. Let's pretend, for argument's sake, that they have $500,000 in the bank. I'll recalculate. That makes them 53% funded. I can take away the special assessment, run a funding plan, and you can see that when they're 53% funded, they don't need a special assessment. But when they're more weakly funded, let's say maybe only having $100,000 or so, and in that case they're 10% funded, I do some calculations, and yeah, they've got a special assessment on their hands, about $3,400 or $3,500 per unit. And let me use that as a segue to get back to the PowerPoint. We'll talk about funding. What am I trying to accomplish? Well, it's moving a lot of money from owners' pockets into the reserve fund so they can do some things. What we're trying to do with the reserve fund is provide cash to the reserves when necessary, in a fair manner, in an even manner, and in a safe manner. These are National Reserve Safe Standard funding principles. Some people think of it with the straight line method, where you put money into individual different pockets of cash. So it might be the roof fund or the asphalt fund, and it might look like this, where they have different individual funds. Well, the problem with that is that, let's say if you need some money to do the fencing project, you may reallocate so you take money from those other things and give it to asphalt and fencing. So from year to year, you may reallocate, and then all of a sudden you start asking yourself, well, why have I even called it asphalt money if I can move it around if I want to? And so the concept grows to that of, well, let's just spread it out evenly, and why don't we just take the dividers out, and all of a sudden what you're looking at is what we call the cash flow method, where it's basically a pool of money that's available for use by the reserve projects as needed. And that's the way that we compute the reserve contributions within an association. Let me show you again how that actually works. You can see here on your screen in a little micro view that I'm directing this association towards full funding. They're gradually getting up to the, I'll show you a larger view. Here you can see that they're starting out at about 10% funded, gradually bouncing up, and eventually getting up to the 100% level. Well, if I want to, I can basically dial them down to just barely have enough cash. And let's try that. They're at $8,990 per month. Let's try $8,000 a month. Ooh, they crash and burn. Try $8,400 per month. They still crash. Finally, they're cash positive. So the difference between having a barely cash positive funding plan, which allows them to almost hit zero in about 5, 10, about 13 years, and a fully funded plan really isn't much difference. What was it, 8,600 compared to 8,990? Grab my calculator, 8,600 divided by 8,990, and we're talking 5% difference. The lesson there, and one thing I hope you are able to leave this session with today, is that there's not a lot of difference in a funding plan that barely provides enough reserve cash and one that is designed, as this one is, to get the association fully funded. It takes a lot of money just barely to fund the reserves at your association so that you can maintain your property in a nice manner and have the funds necessary when you need them without a crisis, a cash flow problem, which means special assessments or deferred maintenance. And that's the end of my brief tour looking over my shoulder as I walk through how we do a reserve study. You've seen me build the concepts from step to step, reserve component list, calculating the reserve fund strength, and then a funding plan. And remember, there's not a lot of difference between funding for a full funding analysis or a baseline funding analysis. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris and get her help to moderate some of the questions that you've typed in while I've been talking. Chris, all yours.